Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalat, wassalam, rasulullah. Welcome to We Are All Okay Wednesday for the 20th of November, 2024. And the topic today is I can't say no. And this topic is so very important because I can really see how so many issues that we're having in our ummah are because we can't say no. And so let's unpack why first before we get into how to say no. So why is it we can't say no? Well, one of the things that I see is that there are perhaps cultural or societal or familial rules that you're not allowed to say no, that younger people aren't allowed to say no to their elders, that certain people are meant to say yes. And that is problematic because actually, of course, we want to, be helpful and responsive to people as much as we can, but we can't do so at the risk of displeasing our creator or at the risk of harming ourselves. And that's, I guess, the two key points that we need to look at when we come to the how. The other thing is stories that we have created that have come from our experiences, particularly through childhood, that we've carried through into adulthood, that have left us running certain behavior patterns where we don't feel that we can say no. That might be because we feel that we're not worthy of our opinion or that we're not good enough. And then as a result, we're running patterns like people pleasing patterns or rescuer patterns, all these sorts of things that lead us to not being able to say no. So what's the problem with not being able to say no? Well, the outcome is that we end up being a doormat, meaning that the people who are out there, who are unreasonable, who are running what we would call entitlement patterns, that they take advantage of people who can't say no. Now, I'm not suggesting they're doing this in a malicious way. I'm just suggesting, for instance, that we've got two behavior patterns now that come together in a way that's not a very healthy way, where one person is taking precedence over the other person. I like to frame it like this because we all have stuck thinking and stuck behavior patterns somewhere along the line. And I don't want us to be pointing fingers at one person's right and one person's wrong, because if we can't say no, we are also part of the problem. We are also creating part of the situation that is enabling them to run their pattern. Okay, so let's just see it neutrally as behavior patterns and not be kind of pointing the fingers at each other, and just focus on our own journey and our own personal healing. So that's one problem, is that we get taken advantage of by the people who are running the opposite type of pattern. The other one is that we end up doing things that really aren't for us to do. In other words, we're saying yes to something that we're maybe not qualified to do, and so we bungle it. We don't do a good job. Or we're saying yes when we've got too much on our plate and we're not able to meet those expectations, and we end up disappointing people. Which, of course, if we're doing all of this from a pattern of I'm not good enough, then we're feeding into that pattern by actually not living up to what we think everyone's expectations are. And so now it's just confirming the fact that we really are not good enough. And the third one is we end up unwell emotionally, spiritually, and physically, because we're doing too much. And then as a result, emotionally, we can become quite bitter and resentful. Bitter and resentful because it looks like, from our perspective, that no one is seeing that we're drowning, Everyone is still expecting everything of us, and no one's reaching out their hand to say, I'm here to help. Now, we have a responsibility ourselves to take charge of that and not be a victim of it, not be, oh, woe is me. Look at the situation I've got into. So far we've covered the why and the what it looks like when we're stuck in it. So how do we come out of it? Well, looking at, the why we're stuck in it gives us some clues. One is we've got our own stuck thinking. That own stuck thinking that is preventing us from just showing up and saying yes or no based on what's the right answer. And so it's really important for us to pursue the self-development or personal development that we need to heal, to grow, to get to a point where whatever that stuck thinking is that we've had is no longer stuck, that we're free from those patterns. And it is all very possible. I'm not going to go into great depth and detail how today, but I'm an example of that. Through doing the work I've done, which I now teach it back to the Fitra, I reached a point where I had an insight where those people-pleasing and rescuer patterns fell away. And literally overnight, I went from feeling so uncomfortable at saying no that when I did say no, I felt so guilty and horrible. And I can't even describe the discomfort I would feel around the word no, to being able to just go, no, that doesn't work for me. And it's such a relief. It's such a relief to just be able to say no. Because there are times I was saying yes when I'm not the right person. There are times when I was saying yes when I didn't have the time. There was times when I was saying yes when in my heart I knew it wasn't the right thing for me to do, whether it was for me personally because I was not in a good space myself, or because perhaps it isn't pleasing to Allah. And so now I follow that feeling inside where Allah is guiding me to yes or no. Because here's the thing. If we have that discomfort, if we're having an emotional response when we're being asked to do something, we're not going to be able to see whether it is something that we should be doing or not. We're just going to be responding from those behavior patterns that we have, from that stuck thinking that we have. Whereas when we're free from it, we can actually see clearly, even if we don't understand the reasons behind it, whether it's a yes or a no. We'll just know in our heart because Allah is guiding us. Because Allah knows what might be involved in what we're being asked, what's being asked of us, knows what the intention is of the other person. We don't know that. Whether their intention is good or not, whether we have the ability or not, what else might be coming up for us in the future that we're not aware of that may get in the way of us fulfilling our commitment if we say yes. Allah knows all of that, and we know none of it. And so that's why we want to say yes and no from that space of knowing, from that space of being guided by Allah in the moment. And when it comes from that space, it doesn't feel uncomfortable to say no, because we know that we're saying no because Allah is guiding us to no, and that it's not going to be a successful answer to say yes if Allah's saying no, that we're actually turning away from Allah's guidance if we say yes. And that that discomfort of wanting to, of displeasing Allah can outweigh any kind of discomfort that it might not be pleasing to the person if we say no. Now, the next question that often comes up is, but what about the other person? What about their reaction? Won't we be letting them down? In actual fact, number one, if we say no, and we absolutely have the right to say no, and they're upset about it, that's their stuck thinking. That's potentially their stuck patterns around societal, familial, or cultural norms, right? It's just their stuck thinking. So we don't need to take responsibility for that. But another way of looking at it, which can be really helpful, is if I say yes when Allah is guiding me to say no, there is something Allah knows that I may not know. That means that I'll possibly let them down and make matters worse if I say yes when the answer is no. I hope that makes sense, that it's better to have that discomfort with them and say no in that moment than to potentially have a bigger situation later on when we've let them down because the answer really was no instead of yes. So that's my, I guess, outline of why we can't say no and the pathway to being able to say no, being our own personal journey of healing and personal development, inshallah. So I'm going to open up the floor now to hear from you any questions you might have around that. If anything's going through your head that's saying, yeah, but what about, yeah, but if any of that's happening in your head, ask me. Let me see if I can counter your yeah, buts. Walaikum salam, Fauzia, welcome. I'm glad you're here. It's good to have South Africa in the room, mashallah. Alhamdulillah. So, anyone got any questions about what I just shared? Who here, let's just see in the chat, who here struggles with saying no? I just want to see out of who's here. And anyone who's listening to the recording, I'd love you to share in the comments of the recording whether you struggle with saying no or not. Because I think there's actually a real, what we call the real pandemic of the world is the ability to say no. We need to be able to say no to our kids. We need to be able to say no to each other. We need to be able to say no to elders. We need to be able to say no to people who are in positions of authority. Not because we want to be defiant and disrespectful, but because no is the right answer. See, there's a lot of people here in the chat saying that they struggle with saying no. Yeah, and one of the examples here being challenged with saying no to teenage kids because of dealing with the tantrums. And I totally get that. And that's another whole, session which we deal with in our parenting teens program. But it starts with what I've shared here about saying no. Because if you have the shift in yourself that I've described here, then saying no to teenagers actually becomes much easier, because one of the things that shifted for me, and the reason, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala facilitated, well, I believe the reason he facilitated this shift in me was because my dua to him actually was, oh, Allah, shift in me what needs to shift so I can be the parent my boys, who were teenagers at the time, need me to be. And they needed me to be able to say no. And they needed me to be able to say no fearlessly, because that's a fear there, a fear of dealing with the tantrums. They needed me to be able to be fearless and say no. And after this shift happened for me, I was able to fearlessly say no to them. And I also got to the point where I could actually be quite playful with how they would come back at me. For instance, I'd say no, and then, they'd try it on, and I'd look at them quizzically and laugh and go, oh, really? You think that's going to work, do you? Instead of buying into it. It became a whole different experience. SubhanAllah. And it's possible for every single one of us. Yeah. So this is a really good point, Jazakallah for sharing about acceptance from other people being important and not wanting to upset people and say yes, even though you don't want to do it. How many here do things for people because they don't want to upset them? Let's see in the chat. How many people the determining factor to do it is to please other people so that you don't upset them? I think we're getting resounding yeses here. I'm going to totally throw a spanner in your works. Okay, you ready? If you are doing it to please them because you don't want to upset them, how can you make what you do intentionally to please Allah? There's a conflict there, isn't there? There is a pleasing the creation over the creator. If you know in your heart the answer is a no, and that's Allah guiding you, you are choosing to please the person over pleasing Allah. Does that put a spanner in the works? Who here feels like that puts a spanner in the works or turns it upside down just a tad? Share with me. I want you to engage with me. We've got a few yeses coming through. See how we are innocently turning away from Allah because of our fears, because of our feelings, because of our concern about other people's feelings. Just like we are responsible for our own feelings, they are also responsible for their own feelings. And if they have feelings around being told no, that's their responsibility, not ours. Because we have a right to say no. We have a right to say no. Aisha's got the emoji with the brain blowing up. Yes, it is mind-blowing. But it's so helpful because the more and more we want to be pleasing Allah, the more and more we can detach from pleasing people. It's a shift. And guess what? Isn't there a hadith where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that if we choose to please Allah, the people will become over the people will become pleased with us. But if we choose to please the people over Allah, Allah will become displeased with us. Isn't there a hadith along those lines to that effect? I don't have it around me. I should have looked it up because that's perfect for this lesson. What about when it's not about right and wrong? For example, going to a restaurant. So here's the thing. If it comes back to, this is where you have to check in with yourself, whether your no is coming from arrogance, stubbornness, ego, whatever, defiance, all these other things that we have as our human experience, or whether our no is coming from the fact that we feel guided by Allah that it's not the right thing to do, even if it's a halal thing and it's not about halal and haram or right and wrong. It's just about you feel that it's not the right thing to do right now. So let's give a scenario, right? So you're thinking about a restaurant, right? And someone is putting forward that they want to go to this restaurant, but something in your heart says, no, I don't think that's a good idea today. It's not coming from ego or arrogance or stubbornness or any of those things. It's coming from a deep knowing that there's something about going there tonight that's not the right thing to do. It could be that Allah's guiding you because they're packed out and crowded and you wouldn't know that till you got there. Or it could be that their chicken is off and everyone's getting food poisoning tonight. Who knows, right? It's not necessarily about the restaurant as a whole or about some kind of like general ruling that no, we're not going to go to that restaurant. It's that Allah's protecting you in this moment to say, no, not that restaurant tonight. And so we trust it even though we don't know why it is. We trust it because it's this deep feeling inside of guidance from Allah. But this is where it's really important to know ourselves between when we're having emotional responses and when we're just in that wisdom, that connection with Allah and following Allah's guidance. Does that answer your question about, for example, going to a restaurant? And so with my kids, for instance, when there's something that on the surface looks okay, but my gut feeling is this isn't okay, I've had to say to my kids sometimes, I can't tell you why, because that kids always go, but why? Why? There's nothing wrong with it. And they try to, I was like, I can't tell you why, but I have a gut feeling that it's not a good idea. And they know now that when I have that gut feeling, I'm not going to budge, so they don't argue with me anymore. It took time, though. At first, they wouldn't accept that as an answer. But that's also teaching them to trust their gut feelings too, isn't it? If we stand by ours. And there have been times when I've been busy or hectic or whatever, and I just wanted to like get them off my case because I had things I was focusing on, and I went against my gut feeling, and there were good reasons why the answer was meant to be no. But because I was busy and I didn't want to hold the limit, because when you set a limit, because no is setting a limit, right? You have to hold the limit because a lot of people won't accept no for an answer. Yeah, so let's do some takeaways from this session. You can either type them, or I'd love to hear a few people come on the microphone and share their takeaway. What are your takeaways from what I've shared today?
We need to be sure we are doing it to please Allah and not people.
Yep, good one. Go ahead, Aisha.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Subhanallah, beautiful reminders. Wow. So what I'm inspired to share and as a takeaway is fix your intentions every time you move ahead. Keeping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in mind and doing it for the sake of Allah alone. And I'm just blown away with the fact that how just the thought of making people happy and just focusing on people and situation, just how overshadow or cover our wisdom.
Yep.
So we are unable to handle or tackle the situation with, of course, without Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keeping in mind or having a correct intention for the sake of Allah and the correct way to handle the situation. Because we might not be able to fix or help anybody or the situation if we are not in our wisdom. How are we going to help anybody? We are unable to help ourselves when we are not in wisdom. How we can step up and show up for someone else. Subhanallah. So when the focus is on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when our intentions are clear, the wisdom that comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is just, wow.
Exactly. Takes so much thinking off your mind, doesn't it?
It does.
You don't need to worry. You just show up and you'll know.
Yes, without any plan that is in our mind. We are just showing up for the sake of Allah with the guidance of Allah. And who can guide?
There's so much we don't know. Like if we go back to the restaurant one, there could be another whole bunch of things. Like maybe Allah knows that we're coming down with the flu and it's better for us not to go out and spread it with everybody. But we haven't got symptoms yet, so we don't know that. And we're actually quite contagious before we actually have symptoms. You know, there's so many things we can't see, we can't know. And so we get stuck in the idea that we need to know in our head why. But the reality is we don't. We need to trust that Allah knows best. And that's it.
Yes, and who can guide better than Al-Hadi? Allah is the ultimate guide. So we need that guidance all the time, in every moment. Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. It's so freeing. It's so freeing. You get to a point where you wonder how anybody else is surviving out there without this, you know? How is anybody out there surviving without knowing Allah and having Allah in as a part of the way they live their life? More takeaways. Come on, is anyone, if you're typing them, keep typing, because we're going to wrap up in a second. Anyone else want to share a takeaway on the mic? A takeaway can be, I didn't get that. That was totally, didn't resonate with me. That's a takeaway. And I'm happy to hear it because I want to know what you got from this so I know whether it's actually beneficial. The other thing with sharing a takeaway is you are more likely to benefit from what you've heard by having to put a takeaway together, because it means your brain goes through this process, or your mind goes through this process of collating the information you just heard to a key point. And that actually, just that process of doing that, that's one of the reasons why I ask you to share takeaways, is because it benefits you, and potentially you will walk away more likely to implement something of it in your life, inshallah. So for me, the takeaway is, from now, I am going to say no if it's not pleasing to Allah, and free myself from arguments and guilt, inshallah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala facilitate that for you, sis. And if you struggle with it, just know that there is support for you to do that transformation, that inner transformation that you need. That's what we do at Back to the Fitra. That's why I put it together, because I realized how important this is, just from my own experience. So Fauzi says, it's mind-blowing. What a beautiful perspective. Yeah, and whatever perspective where there's husnul dhan billah, which is, that's what we're talking about, good thinking of Allah, that perspective is always going to be a beautiful perspective. Alhamdulillah. Then if she goes ahead with it, then Allah is there to deal with it. Exactly. And that is the other thing. No doesn't necessarily mean the person will listen, because there's no in terms of, no, I'm not going to do that. And then there's no in terms of, no, you can't do that, and they still do it anyway, when you're talking about, for instance, parenting. And they may still do it. That doesn't mean your no was no good. It just means they chose to ignore it. And then there'll be implications as a result of that. Everything's about proving yourself in one way or another. This topic is, well, honestly, the more you understand this, the less there's any need to prove anything to anybody, because the only one that it matters with is Allah, right? Who cares what people say? They're not going to be at the gate of Jannah going, yes, you can go in, no, you can't, are they? Who cares what they think? Only matters what Allah thinks. Alhamdulillah. Jazakallah everyone for showing up today. It and participating, because that always helps me with the topic, is when you engage and participate. I look forward to seeing you again next week. If you have any suggestions for topics, feel free to send me a message through our message system in school. So you can send me a personal message. When you've joined the school site, you would have received a message from me, so you can just look through your history to find me and reply to that message. So if you've got any suggestions for a topic, feel free to suggest them. I'm always open to discuss with you the things that are on your mind. Inshallah, that's what we're here for, inshallah. Jazakallah khair. Yes, it is so liberating. Alhamdulillah wa iyaki. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. See you next time, inshallah.